Hey everybody, welcome to the Always Hope podcast, a production of Willwood's Faith in Marriage. This is Dr. Mario Sacasa, and I pray that you're having an amazing day today. Okay, in today's episode, I welcome Luanne Zurlo for an engaging conversation about dedicated singlehood in the Catholic Church. We explore the nuances between dedicated singlehood and the secular world's concept of single life, two very different things. Luanne shares her personal journey of discerning her vocation, the importance of deep prayer when we are discerning, and how she found peace and joy in her dedicated single life. We also delve into how one's vocation is a personal call from God and the significance of building a deep relationship with Christ as we continue on our journey towards holiness. This episode touches on the challenges and blessings of living the dedicated single life and offers practical advice for those who are discerning a similar path. And throughout this conversation, we explore the dynamic between vocation and state of life, the importance of trust and surrender, and the hope and joy found in embracing God's call for us as we surrender to His providence and His plan and His care for each and every single one of us. Well, if you enjoyed this episode, please give it a thumbs up. Like it on Apple Podcast, or also leave a rating or write a review on Spotify. Every little one of those comments helps tremendously. I'm so grateful for those of you who have written statements. It means a lot to me to know that this episode is blessing you, that the show is blessing you, and that you're getting so much great content that is helping you in your life to be able to find those solutions towards a better life. Well, let's get into this conversation with Luanne Zurlo. Luanne Zurlo, welcome to the Always Hope podcast. How are you doing today?
Doing very well. Thank you for having me.
Well, I think we should get this out of the way and let the listeners know up front that this is take two of our conversation. We had a wonderful, epic discussion about your beautiful book, A Single for a Greater Purpose, A Hidden Joy in the Catholic Church, a few weeks ago. And technical issues got in the way of us. When I started editing it, realized that not all of it was recorded. So dear listeners, do not judge my lack of professionalism or quality of the show, but things happen, and we do the best that we can, and we roll with it, and here we are again. So thank you, Luanne, for being a trooper and being a repeat guest on the podcast without being a repeat guest on the podcast. So it's amazing.
Oh, second time will be better.
That's exactly right. Yeah, the first conversation was great, but this one is going to be even better because that's the way the Lord works. So. All right, well, let's get started. I deeply appreciated your book. Single for a Greater Purpose, A Hidden Joy in the Catholic Church. And what I appreciated about it was twofold. One, you introduced this concept of dedicated singlehood and go into details about how your own discernment and journey went to leading you to choose this vocation for yourself. And we're going to speak about that. What is dedicated singlehood? How is it different than consecrated virginity and the other vocations as well? And we'll get into that aspect of it. I just loved your story and your journey and your discernment that you speak about in that process. But you also beautifully just articulate, and I think the book, for me, where I connected with it, because I am married and have been married for a number of years. But the other piece that I appreciate about the book, and as you in your own discernment, your journey that you speak about, is just the notion of how to pray when prayers don't seem to be getting answered. There's how to trust in providence when the plan doesn't always seem to be unfolding quite exactly as we expect it to unfold. And so I'm feeling kind of like both of these are kind of where we're kind of going to go today, and obviously wherever else kind of the Lord leads us. But why don't we start with that first piece then? All right. What is a dedicated singlehood and what does that mean?
So dedicated single is kind of a term I use and I developed it. It's not necessarily one that's been formally recognized in the Catholic Church. Mm-hmm. Let me back up. The whole topic of vocation and what's legitimate or what's acknowledged by the Catholic Church is fraught, and there's been a lot of ink spilled over. Is it a legitimate or real vocation to be a single in the Catholic Church? And some argue not. And I think the reason being is we often confuse terms between state of life versus vocation. And you mentioned earlier in your intro about talking about how I chose this vocation. As many of us know, vocation comes from the Latin root vocare, to be called. And as Catholics, we respond to a call or vocation that God has planned for us since the creation of the world. He knew us. He knew what his plan was. And even if we kind of mess up and might do things differently, he's got a plan for us. And so it took many years for me to kind of discern that God had a plan for me to serve and love him exclusively as his alone in the quote unquote real world. Now, is that a formal vocation or is that a formal state of life? The church historically, in the early years actually, viewed one's role or one's position in the church as kind of, it was in two ways. You were either an ordained priest or you were everyone else. And then gradually, as the religious life developed, starting in the early hundreds of the Catholic Church and really developed into the Middle Ages, the church started to think about or develop this third state of life, the religious state of life. And to be in a formal state of life in the eyes of the Catholic Church, it's canonically recognized, typically take public vows. Usually your life is, or not usually, it's always circumscribed by something, whether it's the bishop, whether it's your community, religious community, or your spouse. You've got a frame or kind of limits around it that structure your life. Well, a dedicated single doesn't have that. It's not a publicly vowed vocation. It's part of being a lay in the lay state. It's a critical element of being a dedicated single is that you are a lay person, and that's very different from being a religious or certainly an ordained priest. And but yet within that, being single, what's tricky is there are so many ways in our world one can live single life. It's probably, I think, got the greatest variation of how one might live. So no matter how good or holy or you are, you have a sense of how someone lives a married life, and you have a sense of how a priest lives out his priestly ordination, his vocation, or religious.
Right.
You might break those vows. You might not be very good at it, but you have a structure.
We have some idea of what it's supposed to be.
An idea. A single person, you could be a libertine, just going out to parties and committing, sexual sins every night, or you could kind of be like a nun in the quote unquote real world. There's such a variety of way of living that, and that can be a little tricky too. And that was one of the reasons I try to have a term for it to help people understand. And I write a lot about, well, why don't you call yourself a celibate or consecrated? And there's reasons for it. And in the church's eyes, unless you've taken public vows, you're not considered consecrated by canon law. So you want to be very careful because the church is brilliant and canon law is there. It's there to serve the human person, and people can criticize it, but it's there for us. So what's important for one to appreciate this as a vocational call is that you've discerned God calls you to this in a permanent way. I'm not sitting waiting around for something better to come along. I'm not waiting perhaps to get married, or maybe down the road I might have a religious vocation. No, your sense is, no, God is calling you to this single state permanently to serve him in this way. And so and it involves embracing it, accepting it, and that's a whole we'll talk about prayer that sometimes can take a long time. So it's a long-winded answer to say it's I think it's something that's both new and old. We have had since the beginning of the Catholic Church from our virgin martyrs. We hear them in one of the Eucharistic prayers in the Mass, Agnes, Lucy, Agatha, these virgin martyrs. that was before formal religious life. They were on some level singles, living with their families typically. Throughout church history, there have been a number of people, saints and venerable, that have lived in the world without formal religious vows, but also without marriage. So in that respect, it's not new. What's new is the fact that there has been an explosion of singles in our society in recent decades. In fact, over half the American population is single, and the vast majority, large majority, never having been married. And this is relatively new. If you look at the numbers, there are probably 50 million more single people today that have never been married than there were 50 years ago.
Yeah. Wow.
It's a lot of people.
It's a lot of people.
And so, and a lot of it's for bad reasons, if you will, we can go into them. But I also think within the Catholic Church, we have many more single. And I think this is something that isn't by accident. God has a reason for it.
Yeah.
And I try to delve into that a bit in the book.
Yeah. Okay. Well, hold on. Before we get into that, because it's beautiful, and we will certainly talk about it. Just help me tease out just a little bit more this notion of vocation versus state of life for folks who maybe have heard those terms or don't really know what that means. Like what exactly? Put some more qualifiers on that. What exactly are you speaking about?
So state of life, it comes from the German to stand. It's like cement, like firm. It's like state. It's a permanence. There's a permanence to it. And where you saw this was in the Middle Ages, for example, and throughout most history, and in fact, throughout most societies, even non-Western societies today, usually it was pretty clear when you were born how you were going to live your life and kind of your state. You didn't have many options.
Right.
It wasn't
if
like
your dad was a shoemaker, you became a shoemaker.
You were a shoemaker. Yeah. Or if you were in the Middle Ages, if you were of a princely class, you were then or if a serf class, you stayed in that state or class. And so it's a little foreign to our American sensibility, where everything is so fluid and you can change everything practically these days, or one thinks they can about who they are in their life.
That's right.
And
careers, I mean, again, some of it, I've had a lot of jobs, over the course of my life. So I understand some of it, but not the extremes that you were just alluding to. I just want to be clear to everybody that that's not what it's referencing.
Like there's goodness to that. I think there's good and bad. But so state of life in the Catholic Church, it's something, your state, that it's canonically recognized. It's permanent. There's public vows, and as I mentioned, there's a structure around your life. Vocation, as viewed and understood in the Catholic Church, is also permanent. And there's some beautiful quotes. I quote Francis de Sales, who talks about the idea of it being a permanent assent to something God is calling you to. And typically we think of vocation as the same as state of life, but vocation has, I think, a more of a personal element to it. I think of, in really concrete terms, a way sometimes I think about it is swimming lanes. So I swim. And a lane, you have lanes, is like a state of life. Within that lane, there's many ways you could swim. I could do the breaststroke, I could do the crawl, the backstroke. So like you might be in a canonically religious state of life. There's many types of orders of religious. Or priest even. You can be a diocesan, religious. You could, different kinds of ways you serve out your priesthood, maybe an administrative in the Vatican or in a tiny parish church. And so I also think of that in lay terms. In the lay state, you historically, that's just been viewed as a lay state, and especially since Vatican II, there's been much greater emphasis placed on marriage within the lay state. It's a canonically recognized vow, but it's within the lay state. And it's understood because marriage has, it's come under attack, and it historically hasn't been viewed as high of a calling, if you will. And that's a lot has been done, especially in the 20th century since the Second Vatican Council, to really understand and appreciate the richness of the marriage vocation. Well, in so doing, I think inadvertently, we've many of us have equated the lay state
Right.
with the marriage state.
That's right.
And it's kind of left those singles in the lay state kind of pushed aside, or some feel shunted or pushed aside. Whereas historically, the lay state was one big, that was it. And the marriage was wasn't as emphasized to such a degree. So I don't know if that's helpful.
That's very
discerning
helpful.
Between state of life
Yeah.
versus vocation.
Yeah, I'm a runner. I don't get all the swimming analogies, but I do. I'm just joking.
The couple ways of run too. I
Yeah,
suppose.
I guess so. But just one foot in front of the other. I mean, I've done a couple marathons. I don't see a lot of people skipping or hopping for those 26 miles. But the point's well taken. It's beautiful that the lane would be the state, as you indicated, but so the way you're swimming is the particular expression. And that's really a beautiful way of kind of being able to articulate it. And so when we look at then the lay state specifically, as you indicated, since Second Vatican Council, rightfully so, marriage has needed to be restored in the articulation. And we're so grateful for particularly John Paul II and the amount of ink that man spilled on the marital vocation and helping us really understand like what's going on here and giving us a lot of great answers and understanding theologically and really helping to elevate that great sacrament. But as you indicated, and I would agree, I think maybe even I've fallen into some of that myself as I read over Lumen Gentium, for example, which is the Second Vatican Council document that gives us a wonderful understanding of the lay state, that you do kind of think that, well, maybe people are just leading towards this is just marriage. This is just what it means to be in the world. And it's like, no, there are folks who are living a single life and not just waiting for that to happen, but living a single life and trying to find the Lord in this space. And I guess you give us a little bit more detail about that. I mean, you kind of said earlier that it's not just single in the libertine sense, or maybe, I don't know, for lack of a better way of saying it, in the feminist sense, I guess, if I'm saying that, kind of what the modern woman is kind of exalted to be this single, as if that is because you can do everything, you can be by yourself, you're self-sufficient. And we've elevated singlehood almost above marriage in the sense that it's greater freedom. If you can provide for yourself financially, it's more capable. All of that is kind of almost kind of a virtue that we're exalting kind of in our culture today. You're obviously not articulating that. So how does then the single life in a dedicated singlehood look in a Catholic sense or the Christian sense, contrast that vision or that version of what our modern society is exalting?
So much is intent and how you view the fact that you're living without a formal structure around you. Is that for libertine so-called freedom, or is it the way God wants you to serve in a more free-form, flexible way? I sometimes call dedicated singles those that are living espoused to Christ in the world. That you are dedicated to your primary relationship with Christ in the world, kind of like a free agent. Because of your lack of structure, you can serve in places and ways, corners of the world that few others can. And I talk about, in today's world, we're so influenced by witness, and we aspire to models, people we see. And now that we've really become a much more secularized society, so many people don't have interaction with religious or with ordained. And so to evangelize, I think there's so many pockets, more than pockets. There's so many huge places in our society where it really is up to the lay person, and you can interact with people that would ever either never come across, or the idea of a religious or a priest is so foreign that they can't even relate to that. Whereas if they see someone they might have gone to school with in their workplace, let's call it in the gymnasium, and they say, well, that person's kind of like me, or they're not that different, but there's something different about them. What what is different? What is attractive about that person? And that is a means of evangelization that's very typical, or not typical. It's very much talked about in Lumen Gentium and Vatican II. But I think in terms of the singlehood, as you said, it's lauded by secular society today, but yet it's so lamented by those of us who take our faith very seriously. There's so many, especially women, but men too, but there's so many within like Catholics, and I would imagine in the Protestant denominations, but in the Catholic Church, that they laud marriage, they want to get married, and they, for whatever reason, haven't found their spouse. It just hasn't worked out. You mentioned, they may pray for it day after day, month after month, year after year. And they're told, oh, this is the great thing out in the real world, but I don't feel great about it. Mm-hmm. And yet within the church, it's, I think single life viewed as a libertine means of behavior is not lauded by any means. It's looked down on, is not a good. Mm-hmm. And so you're kind of caught, they're kind of caught in this. And so I think what really is critical and what is how you live that vocation. I mean, if you are living your spousal relationship with Christ well, it is obvious. It is obvious there's a difference between who you are, versus someone who's living that for very different reasons. Mm-hmm. I don't know if that answers.
No, that's beautiful in the sense that, like we said, it is exalted. It's praised to be a single person because there's all this freedom that comes, and that libertine freedom, as you said, almost is. And I'm not saying this. I don't mean to be. It's perceived to be at times rather selfish, in the sense that it's for me. I have my own money. I can do my own things. I can have whatever relationships I want. And that type of individualism is certainly what's exalted within our culture. But what you're speaking about is this notion that we're all called to this spousal relationship with Christ. And that's the vocation of all Christians. That is exactly what it means to be part of the bride of Christ, which is the church. That we're all meant to live our lives in a way that is generative towards the Lord. And when you speak about the singlehood being this free agent, we said kind of two things. One, there's like the sense of being a free agent, that we have the capacity to go kind of wherever God leads us, which is very beautiful in a missionary kind of context. But then this other sense that you can be a witness in a way that religious and priests can't. And even maybe married people at this stage of the game, where folks single, the world doesn't even understand what marriage is to some degree. Mm-hmm. So when you're speaking about being a single person and having these relationships, what has that been like for you? I mean, I know that you have had this successful career in finance, and you also are a practicing Catholic. And so how have you interacted with friends who are, I'm sure, maybe on both sides of kind of this political spectrum here, secular, Christian, across the board? How has your witness or your life spoken to both groups, or just how has that been for you, I guess is what I'm trying to ask.
So, it's kind of interesting because I went to secular schools and had a secular career before doing work that was more closely aligned with the church. And on some levels, my secular friends, many who have no faith really, are more accepting of me than some within the church, because I think, to your point, they understand it better. They don't have, they're not putting marriage on a pedestal like we as Catholics do. And they're also, I think, but at the same time, they see that there's a difference. There's like, Luanne's not doing this just to work more hours, right, or to have a better social life or whatever. And how I think they see it is, my commitment to the Catholic Church in terms of, daily mass, or I remember once having to turn down an invitation to attend a wedding because it was on Easter it was on Easter, actually, and that's sacrosanct, and I did with my family for Easter. And I also, some social issues now that have become more and more heated in our society around abortion and other things. They know where I stand, and I'm probably the only pro-life person they know, but yet I'm not a crazy, because they know her.
Right.
She's like, she's not one of those crazy. So we got to take this seriously.
Yeah.
It's like, we know her, we respect her. So maybe there's something legitimate about that issue that if they didn't know anyone, they wouldn't have been as open-minded about. So in terms of, the Catholic Church, I will say, living in New York City for many, many years, there are a number of dedicated single women. I know a number of them, and it's so helpful to have a community, have others that really understand kind of how you live your life in this vocation. And so in that respect, it was very helpful to know other women and to feel like we have a community, we have Christian fellowship. And what I would say about all of us, those that have kind of discerned, no, this is what God's calling me to. I'm not waiting for marriage or something else. There's a sense of peace and joy. I think as long as you don't feel quote unquote landed, like this is it, this is what my life's going to be like for the foreseeable future. There's a sense of unsettledness, a sense of lack of peace. And I know that for myself. For years, I was of the generation, attended university in the mid to late 80s. And all we thought about was, preparing ourselves for a career. And I studied abroad for many years. I did a lot of very interesting things. Yeah. I was just engrossed in it.
You're a proud Gen Xer.
I guess, right on the I'm supposedly right on the border, but an old Gen Xer. And I'm not going to make a crack about millennials. We're allowed of millennials lately, but anyway, we won't go there. But anyway,
even millennials are old. We're old now, I guess. I'm kind of right on the verge between millennial and Gen X. I'm kind of, I don't know which one I am, but Gen Z's got us all beat, so it's all right.
But
you're saying.
In any case, I then in my later, I guess late 20s, 30s, I'm like, I dated. This is the time you think about marriage, and I just never met someone I wanted to give my life to. And I knew what a sacramental marriage was like. And so I had really high expectations. For a while, I would pray for a spouse like St. Joseph. I would pray to St. Joseph. And it's interesting and then I would start praying, well, if it's your will for me. This is to the point about when you're praying, you're not getting what you want, even if what you want is so good. It's a good you want. I liken it to married couples who can't conceive or carry children. They want such a good, and can be such a heartache. And so I started praying more. I started praying more your will, like Jesus, and was starting to occur to me. Especially when I started to pray to St. Joseph for a husband like Jesus, for like him. And that's when I started thinking through, well, maybe Jesus. And I started thinking through, could this be what God is calling me to? And once I was really open to that, pretty quickly, I started to embrace it, and a great peace came. And I realized this is it. And I was kind of in a sense in prayer that kind of Jesus was like, what took so long? But I also had this sense like, but why me? I'm like, why me? But God calls whom he will. And so.
I appreciate you sharing that. I just have one more distinction question I want to ask before I follow up more with what you just beautifully shared about your own story and testimony, because I'm sure people are asking this. How would you frame the difference between dedicated singlehood and consecrated virginity?
So good question. And I had an interaction dialogue with this extraordinary consecrated single who also has a degree in canon law. And she actually has a website, because I was trying to understand the same thing. And there's the obvious thing: a consecrated virgin has to be a virgin.
Has to be a virgin. Yep. And you do that public consecration that you spoke about.
It's a public consecration, and you take a vow of obedience to the bishop. And it's consecrated virgins. I'm not 100% certain if it's required canonically, but anyone I've known, they work within the church. They're more at the quote unquote beck and call of the church. And they tend to be more permanent. They are permanent
diocese.
to that diocese, to that bishop. Now, a lot of it's got a story or long, rich history, consecrated virginity. As a vocation in the early part of the 20th century, the canon law, they eliminated it, or they basically, it was no longer really, it's really no longer focused on in the church. And then, as you know, canon law has evolved, and in recent decades, it's come back, if you will, and there've been some more clarity around that vocation by canon law. But it's a public vow that one takes in obedience to the bishop. I also, in the back of the book, I have a list of kind of different kind of nuances between the two. A dedicated single, apart from not taking public vows, a lot of us work not in lay fields in the secular world. There's more flexibility. I think personality-wise, I think God calls those of us to dedicated single vocation. Those of us who have, I think, particular characteristics. First of all, you have to be, I think, contemplative to a level. You have to have a deep prayer life, because you really have to be sensitive to the inspirations of the Holy Spirit. You have to create your own structure. You have to be disciplined, because no one's telling you. You're not being woken up in the middle of the night by an ailing child or an ailing family member. You're not obedient to your superior, or you really have to listen carefully to the promptings of the Holy Spirit, which necessarily means you're spending a lot of time on your knees, and you're very comfortable with contemplative prayer. And I think you're also someone that tends to be kind of more independent-minded. I remember I wrote this incident in the book once. It was just by happenstance during lunch hour. There was this person that analyzed handwriting.
Okay.
And I'm like, oh, that sounds kind of interesting. I'd never really, in some places it's really respected. And I remember she looked at it and she's just like, oh, you wrote outside of the lines. And I'm like, I didn't know there was a rule against writing outside the line. She goes, oh, you break all molds and you're very independent. Like it was,
yeah.
And I'm like, well, that actually, I always remember that. It's like, yeah, I just kind of do my own thing. I follow, follow my own nose. And so I think you have to be a little more comfortable kind of carving new paths, because it's new on some levels. To live a life where you're deeply committed to Christ and the church in today's society, it is countercultural.
Yeah.
And you don't have a husband or a wife or a religious community or the structured church that you can rely on quite as moment by moment. You're kind of out there.
That's right. So when you go to your own questions of the sermon, you've spoken beautifully already about some examples of this. That point of transition, if you can give us a little bit more information about that. You said that there was time that you went on dates, you were praying for your St. Joseph to come up, he never did. And then you started thinking, well, what about Jesus? What was that process for you? Because I can imagine a lot of women listening are probably in that space, and maybe some of them, maybe honestly, are probably feeling a little panic about that. It's like, whoa, hold on. You're telling me that if I'm in my late 30s and I haven't found my husband yet, that I have to, this is my path? And the answer is no, of course. Like, it's all in discernment. I know folks much later in their 50s and 60s who are still discerning and looking for marriage, and that's where that desire has not left them. So we're not saying that for everybody, but there could be some folks listening who maybe they haven't really given that question much thought. What was that process like for you? Like, when did you become aware of it? You're like, oh, well, maybe I don't need to be looking for a husband. Maybe I can find that in Christ, and I can live this single life.
You have to really pray, I think, seriously. And really, in your heart, be open to what God wants from you. And in the beginning, like, what I find, when you've been hurt by someone or you might be really angry with someone, I find the quickest way to have that hurt be healed or dissipate the hurt or the anger is you pray for that person. Like, and you're doing it through gritted teeth. It's like, I'm just saying the words, but I don't really mean it. But you keep doing it.
Yeah.
And I find pretty quickly it works, if you will.
You're a better person than me, Luanne. That's all I got to say. I got some people I've been praying for years for, so and it's still through gritted teeth.
Well, it's but then, so I think that's with the same with, but your will. Jesus, find me a husband like St. Joseph, but your will. And you're probably just mouthing it. You don't really mean it. It's like, I really want this husband. I know it's your will. Then gradually, it just sometimes just takes time. I think that your will becomes deeper in your cells. I prayed the rosary, and every rosary, there was one decade I would pray for different intentions in each rosary and each decade. And so, for example, for the joyful mysteries, it was, I would pray for a spouse in it was always the third mystery. It was the
Nativity.
Nativity. That's less obvious. Let me try to think. Each one I had.
Yeah.
For example, now the luminous mysteries.
Yeah.
The wedding at Cana. That was like pray for a spouse. That was an obvious one.
For sure.
Or it was carrying the cross during the sorrowful mysteries. I'm like, I'm carrying this cross.
Yeah.
Bring me the husband, but patience. Like, I knew that was a virtue that was really aligned to that particular mystery. And so after time, as I said, I think God doesn't hide his will. He sometimes takes forever to show it to you, to make it clear, but he's not going to hide it. So that's why I say that prayer is really important. Prayer in front of the Blessed Sacrament, that really, I find it's like turbocharged. It's kind of like putting on the accelerator. It's like any prayer in front of the Blessed Sacrament, there's something more intense and fruitful about it. And so, it's that. And it's also, this might not be nice or might be more negative, but I also, you put on the pedestal marriages. It's not like every marriage is the most blissful thing in the world.
Sure.
And
as a marriage therapist, I can attest to that statement. So
absolutely. And so I think part of it's being realistic about what do I want marriage for all the right reasons? Like, do I really think I'm going to be that much happier? Like, maybe that could be the case, but at its fundamental core, marriage is helping the other person get to heaven. And it is giving yourself over to another person. And that's tough. Like, and that's tough. It is. You're giving your will over on a day-by-day basis to live marriage well.
Yeah.
And so it's like, don't think that's a piece of cake either.
Hey everybody, this is Dr. Mario Sacasa taking a quick break here from my conversation with Luanne Zurlo to encourage you to check me out on the socials, particularly on Instagram. We have a number of great posts that we're putting there and clips and reels and all sorts of wonderful things and conversations that we're trying to accomplish on Instagram. It's also the best way to be able to communicate with me. If you have a question about this episode or any other episodes, then that's the place to go. Hit me up on Instagram, ask your question, leave your comment, and I get back to you as soon as I possibly can. I love to be able to dialogue with my listeners. It means a lot to know that people are in fact listening and engaging with these episodes and asking questions, because it means that we're just having a conversation. So many blessings to you. Find me on Instagram, check me out, and let's get back into this conversation with Luanne Zurlo. No, somebody who's been married for 21 years, that is a act of the will at times, you know, as I tell my wife, or she tells me sometimes, it's like, yeah, I'm choosing to love you today. I just want you to know that, you know. That's it. Okay, so if somebody's kind of listening, the question would be, all right, at what point do we let go? And what is the difference then between acceptance that this could be God's plan for me, that I'm called to be a single person, a dedicated single, versus just being resigned to it and saying, ugh, like, really? Yeah. The sloppy seconds type of feeling.
Yep. It's a tough one. I'll just say, if you accept and embrace, to me, they're almost the same. You embrace it, you will have a greater peace and more joy. Resignation. And that might be, you know, I think of Mother Teresa. Remember, we read that after she died and some of her papers became available.
Yeah, come be my light.
Because she lived the dark night of the soul for many years. And maybe that is God's call for you. Maybe that is your cross. That your cross is like a married couple that cannot have a child. Your cross is you will never find that deep peace or embracement of that. I don't want to sound depressing.
That's rough.
I don't. But maybe that's the other thing we think is, I mean, our life is so short compared to eternity. I mean, honestly, our life is a blink compared to eternity. And
but there's
so
some moments that feel really long.
Sometimes it does, but I'm thinking, you know, that might be God might be preparing for you a really high place in heaven. But I also kind of think too that God wants us to be happy.
That's
he really does. He wants, and I think he really built you for a particular vocation. I'm absolutely convinced of that. So I'm not convinced that if you deeply in your heart are open to God's will, deeply, and it might take months and years, that you, and that is God's will for you to be his alone in the world, then I do think you'll come to embrace it. Now, it's interesting. I have a couple of single friends that haven't, like, in their head, it's not like you have to scream it from the top of the world. I don't talk about it to anyone, frankly. I wrote a book, which I just felt called to do. I didn't want to. Like, oh, not that. But I just kept getting this message. You got to, I'm like, really? And part of me, actually, the discernment process for me, because I think through things before they hit my heart. I kind of live in my head. And I'm like, I need to understand this vocation. And I do. And I did a lot of research. I talked to a lot of priests. I was so blessed. God he threw them in my path at every corner. It's like, you have canon law questions? Here's a canon lawyer. He just threw me in the path. Like, and he's always done that about my spiritual reading. He just throws books in my path. And so through all that research, it helped me think through this. And in fact, I was so blessed to study theology at the Angelicum in Rome for a semester, and I got to know the papal theologian, Father Wojciech Giertek. He's this really kind of, on the outside, this scary, brilliant Dominican, but he's just a little, jewel behind Vatican walls. And he's like, in his thick Polish accent, it's like, Luanne, you wrote this book to understand why you're in this vocation, like to
Yeah,
understand
yeah,
yourself. And I'm
yeah.
like, yeah, you're right. Um, and so what I would say is just really God wants you to be happy. He loves you.
I
Like
believe that.
part of it is when you have a sense of God the Father is kind of this taskmaster and kind of this,
Well,
stereotypical Old Testament view of this
I
harsh
I think
father.
it's that,
You might think that.
but I think it's also this notion that, and you talk about this in the book a few times. We sometimes get caught up in this, back to that question of state and vocation, or that almost we live in this predeterministic sense that God has this thing, and that's the thing, and we're only supposed to do that thing, and if we don't do that thing, then we have failed. And there's a great quote that you have here from Pope Benedict that I really do want to read. It says, getting a little lengthy here, but bear with me, audience. God did not intend for Israel to have a kingdom. The kingdom was a result of Israel's rebellion against God. God yields to Israel's obstinacy and so devised a new kind of kingship for them. The king is Jesus. In him, God entered humanity and espoused it to himself. This is the usual form of divine activity in relation to mankind. God does not have a fixed plan that he must carry out. On the contrary, he has many different ways of finding man and even of turning his wrong way into right ways. The feast of Christ the King is therefore not a feast of those who are subjugated, but a feast of those who know that they are in the hands of the one who writes straight on crooked lines. What a beautiful, beautiful quote. Benedict's one of my favorites. And just speaking to that, this notion that we think that like the future is already determined, it's already written, it's already there. And in some sense, yeah, of course, eternity, God has won it for us. Eschatological man is there in terms of waiting for us in the sense of who we're going to be and what it means for us to be the best versions of ourselves. But what the church is reminding us is that God is still operating within history, within our time, within our presence, and is using all the circumstances of our lives, all the hurts, all the pains, all the longings, the geography, the exact moment in time that we're in, every aspect of who we are. He's using it to continue to create this life that he has for us. And so we sometimes, and while I do believe, of course, God has a plan, absolutely, and God is calling us, and God is leading us, absolutely, God has something in mind for us, 100%, yeah. But the person he's created us to be, he knows that who we're created to be is also in the consequence of who we are and how we've lived in our lives. And so he's using all of that to guide us forward. And so people can be listening to that and say, well, I'm single, I'm in my early 40s. Are you saying, Mario, that there's a version of me out there in the multiverse of all these movies like we're seeing that probably would have been happy being married? I don't know. It's a foolish question to be asking, is what I would say to anybody thinking that. I would say, where are you now? Who are you now? Where is your heart now? What are you feeling? What are you discerning? If you're doing the things you're speaking about in terms of praying and discerning, where is God calling you in this moment? And can you come to a sense of peace and say, well, maybe God isn't calling me to marriage. Maybe my life would be more fruitful living in this single state. But if that's the case, then go for it. Maybe you say, but no, I mean, like I really think God's calling me to marriage. Then okay, then go for it. Then do the things that you need to do. Go on dates, meet people. You have to get out there then. You have to actually do something about that. St. Joseph isn't just going to knock on the door one day and present himself like some Amazon truck driver, or it's like, that's not the way this is going to happen. And so God is, the point in this is that God's using our will and our experiences together with his plan and his desires for us. And it's constantly creating this beautiful life that we have a say in.
It's like a dance.
It's a dance.
It's a dance.
Yeah, it's a dance.
I think you're so right. And, as you were saying this, I was thinking back to that person who has kind of a resignation towards that. And I'm thinking,
or resentment also.
Or resentment. Yeah. But, and you know what? At the core, if you truly in the cells believe that God has your best at heart, and if you trust in him, that's the other thing, the trust, the divine mercy. I think divine mercy is so important. If you really trust God every moment, you will be joyful in that. You will live like you. It's. I think it's a sign of a little bit, and believe me, I'm there. Like none of us are perfect, but
Yeah.
there's a little bit of a lack of trust. It's like you want this, but you're not getting it. And if you're doing the right thing, you're not sitting home on the couch day in and day out, but you're making yourself out in the world. And yet God still isn't presenting to you a spouse that maybe it means because he's waiting for another 5 years he doesn't want, or maybe it's because that's not his will. But I think it really boils down to God has a reason, and day in and day out, he's got that day planned. I love in Matthew, God's got, the hairs on your head counted.
Yeah.
I mean, if you really believe that in your core, you're not going to worry. I think it takes heroic faith. But I think that's what we need to
Most days.
we need to strive
Most days I
towards.
believe that. Most days I believe that, Luanne. Most days. Maybe not every day, if I'm being honest, but most days I believe that. Because I think the piece of the book that, as I said earlier at the beginning of a conversation, that I just connected with is whether God reveals the state of life or the vocation, as we all journey through life and as we're all trying to co-create and be on this adventure with the Lord and pursuing his will, there are going to be a lot of ideas or discernments that we thought were going to pan out that don't. And I know in my life, I've had plenty of what I would say, quote unquote, failed discernments, things that I was like, all right, Lord, I thought this is what you wanted for me. And that didn't work out the way that I expected it to. Come on, man. I thought this was supposed to be the way it was. And this is what I had discerned. And then what I've realized is, oh no, sin is a real factor in life. And things do kind of thwart sometimes his plans or sometimes, again, I say this with nuance. Sometimes God allows us to go through some of these hardships to force us to grow, to force us to mature. I'm thinking here of, I don't know if you're a C.S. Lewis fan or ever read the Chronicles of Narnia, Eustace in the Voyage of the Dawn Treader, who is this just annoying brat.
Yeah.
That when he turns into the dragon, but a beautiful symbol, he becomes this evil thing. But then when it comes on the other side of that and is transformed back into a boy, he is humbled by the experience, and that process of becoming the dragon is the process of maturity and growth, and he becomes this great character as the story continues with the subsequent books. That's part of the journey for us, that God uses these sufferings, these experiences, these hopes deferred, these unanswered prayers, these hardships. And believe me, I can tell you, I certainly have gone through my share of them. That God, I have to believe, as you indicated, that God still wills my happiness and that God still desires my happiness and that he isn't calling me to a life of misery. And I have to believe that. I have to choose to believe that sometimes.
Couple things. Well, I say it all the time because it's been so true in my life, and that is my greatest disappointments have often turned out to be my greatest blessings. I think back at things I really wanted and I didn't get, or it turned out differently, and then I look back and I'm like, thank God, now I see why it went this way and not that way. Also thinking, I think baptism is extraordinary. And you kind of were leading to this point that I think is important, and that is, I think sometimes we put too much weight on what am I supposed to do in life, or what is my vocation in life. And the most important vocation we all have as baptized Christians is to live out our baptismal promises, to develop and deepen our relationship with Christ. To really live the Trinity in our heart, to live it deeply. And how we do that, whether a priest, a religious sister, a married person, lay person, whether it's whatever, just is so secondary to that relationship with God. And I do, and then about your humble point, like I think of myself, I'm like, gosh, if I had married someone, or if I had been called and I was open to a religious life, I really think I'd be more arrogant. I think one of the fruitful and beautiful things about this vocation is it is a humble vocation. And humility, I'm convinced, is like the fourth secret theological virtue. I mean, humility is just so important. You know, when Mary, in Divine Mercy, to Saint Kowalska, she says, "What to the Blessed Mother?" She asks her, "What virtue is most important to you? Is the most important?" And Mary says, "Humility, humility, and humility." It is, and it's so counter to our culture. I mean, It's so counter to everything. Our all the social media. We're just always, putting our trying to get attention and everything. And humility is, it's just. I don't think you can really have a really intense relationship with God, Christ, without humility. And what's so ironic is back in the early part of the church, in the early centuries, I have a quote in there was it Augustine, a quote by a church father warning the virgins, dedicated virgins around the church, not to get too fat-headed, because it was so viewed as such a high vocation. And virginity was viewed, and throughout the history of the church, celibacy is viewed as a higher vocation. And they're like, don't get too fat-headed because you got to be humble. And I think how reversed today.
Yep.
Chastity and virginity is viewed as just
the oddball. Yep,
it's
absolutely.
the crazy thing.
Yeah. That's exactly right. Well, what can the church do better now? What people who are in pastoral ministry, priests who are listening, folks who are family members who have family members that are singles, like what can we as a church do better to outreach to singles?
So a couple things. I would say as a parent, I think it's helpful, and my parents were fantastic around this. They didn't push the marriage thing. They weren't always like, haven't you found someone yet? And I know young women and not so young women that they get so much pressure from home, and they're made to feel belittled or at home by that. And that's I mean, you want to be helpful. And I just heard of a case yesterday where this couple met in Boston, and they were each the lector. They wanted to find a spouse. One was the lector at 9:00 Mass and the other at 10:30 Mass in the same church. For 5 years. And finally they met, somehow not at the church, in some other setting.
Wow.
And they realized this, and the priest said, "Oh yeah," they knew them both. And I'm like, that darn priest, he should have introduced them, because he knew both of them were looking for a spouse. No, and I'm serious. I'm bad for you. You should have, but maybe that was God's plan.
Priests are guys, Luanne,
But maybe God wanted.
If it was a religious sister, she would have been like, "Yeah, absolutely, we'll make this happen." He's still a dude, We don't get it all the time.
That's what I thought afterwards. But maybe God wanted them to wait 5 years.
Yeah.
That
maybe
was clearly in God's plan. Yeah. But the point I'm making is here is what could the church do?
Yeah.
Like, especially as a parent, priest. How many priests have come to me, have read the book and said, "Thank you, it's been helpful," because how many of them have parishioners, very devout parishioners, many of them daily Mass communicants, who are looking for a spouse, and they're feeling and the priest said, "I don't know how to provide spirit, I'm at a loss. How do I provide spiritual guidance?" And this was really helpful. So I think just the fact that there is a way to live this out in a beautiful and joyful way is important for priests to know. Thirdly, what I would say is there's been a lot of canonical work done in the 20th century around secular institutes, around, we have the Opus Dei prelature. Those were new things that really developed over the decades in the 20th century into our current century. And the church has gradually come to understand these new ways of living out, whether it be religious or lay vocations. And so I do think more canonical and theological work has to be done, particularly theological work. So my hope is some smart Dominican or Franciscan or whomever, they'll do, I think, more serious theological work around this. Because I do think in today's age and world, I truly believe God is calling an army of us dedicated little souls to be his free agents, if you will, in the world.
How can the church then just help? Or maybe this is a different question, is if somebody's thinking this and they're saying, well, what about the lonely question? How do I navigate that? How would you respond to that?
So I think it's important. I think having...
because, God does say it's not good for man to be alone,
right.
in Genesis. And so how does one navigate that aspect of this discernment?
So I've been very blessed myself to have developed a large array of friendships, and particularly Christian friendships. And partly perhaps it's in other single dedicated Christians, and maybe it's helpful being in a more urban area. I think you tend to have, I think if you're in a much more remote area, I think it's more lonely or more challenging. So I think developing a few really good Christian friendships. Family is, sometimes you obviously you don't have control over everything, but for me, family has been really important, staying close to family. Because of this vocation now, I'm able to spend a lot more time with my aging parents who need more support. And I'm able to do that. I have the flexibility. I would say in at least the dedicated singles I know, generally speaking, we tend to be more introverts. And I do think if you are just this really outgoing extrovert, I think it's harder, or it takes more interaction to fill your heart than it does for some of us introverts. What I know is, for me, spending my time alone for days on end, if I get that opportunity, is such a joy. I love it.
Wow.
So I think that's just how God made me.
Yeah.
But I'd say first and foremost, try to develop a couple spirit friendships with those that understand, that faith is at the center of their life. That's for me been probably one of the most important elements. So this is always a fraught question of finding a really good spiritual director.
That's
it's
right.
so hard. It's so hard because the good ones are so busy.
Yeah.
But if you can, that's, I think, very helpful.
I love how you kind of said in passing, just with family, like, well, you can only control so much, because your circumstances, as you articulated, have been blessed that your parents have been supportive, and that now you have this freedom to be able to help them. But I know that's not everybody's circumstances, and not everybody's parents are going to understand that type of discernment. But that happens, again, even in marriage, that folks don't always approve of who their children marry, and don't necessarily approve of the spouse, and those can become contentious as well. And so, again, in those circumstances, I just encourage people to, you got to accept what you can control and let go of the rest. And part of growing up is you realize that you're an adult also, and you can start transitioning to having an adult relationship with your parents, which is different as well, and not having to put as much pressure on them to have to be perfect. And you can bring those longings that you have, to the Lord. So, all right, that's beautiful. Any other words that you would offer if people are listening and they're men or women who are kind of discerning this? Any other thoughts or final comments that you would want to offer to them?
I would just say that God loves us so much, and we hear this over and over again. But I think sometimes we just need to think about that and pray about that, because if God loves us so much, he truly wants us to be joyful and happy and wants the best for us. And just try to pray about that so that it really penetrates your deep core. Because I think so much angst and anxiety is expressed or being felt around this issue. And God knows that. It's truly putting yourself at his in his hands, in trusting that he's got this. I'm like, so many times I don't understand things. I'm like, I just don't, like, you've got to have this. Let's just, and talk. Like, I find, as a dedicated single, someone who's in a spousal relationship, Christ, like in my head, you dialogue. Like, that's another way, like as St. Paul says, pray always. Well, I mean, how do you pray always? It's like, always have him, try to always come back to him and try to make his presence a little bit more kind of concrete in your mindset as you live through your days. And I think that helps you develop kind of more of a trust that God's got your back. He knows what's best for you. And frankly, we can be stupid a lot. I can. We just, I eat the wrong foods. I drink the wrong, it's just like, you just, but God, he's not, he knows what's best for you.
Yeah.
And sometimes what I want is not what God thinks is best or knows is best for me.
But his
and it's
mercy,
being humble enough to realize that.
Amen. His mercy endures forever, and we can always begin again. And we always just keep going. Just keep going. That's it. Well, people are interested in getting the book. What's the best way for them to get their hands on it?
So it's published by Sophia Press, and so you can go to the Sophia Press or the Amazon route.
The Amazon, the dreaded Amazon.
I know Sophia Press would be appreciative. I actually had a try. I send my books away, so this is what the cover looks like,
it's
and
beautiful.
It's not that expensive. It's I did get the imprimatur from Cardinal Dolan because what was really important to me is that people realize that this is orthodox. This is coming from the church. This isn't some, as one friend, Catholic friend, he's like, watch out that you're not going too Protestant, living without, outside the structure. I'm like, no, this has to be blessed and embraced by the church.
Describe the cover. Describe the cover. It's like a bird.
So the publisher, Sophia, did this lone bird, and I thought, my gosh, that's perfect, because you're kind of, there's a sense of the Holy Spirit, obviously, when you see a bird, but this sense that you are a lone. There's
a sense of freedom out
bird.
there. Yeah.
Freedom, sense of freedom.
Yeah, bird, flying. Again, not in the context of what we just always want to qualify that in the sense of the worldly notions of freedom, but as you talked about, being this free agent to live for the Lord.
Free to serve him however he calls you.
Yeah, the beauty of the church is that there is a plenitude of vocations. There's no shortage of the vocation, and so wherever you are in your life, God is calling you, and there is a glove to fit that beautiful hand. It certainly is there, and that is absolutely one of the great gifts that the church has given to us.
I'm pawing through my book because there's a section my memory is so poor, where I talk about a number of single people. The founder of the Legion of Mary, Gaudi, Antonin Gaudi, who was the famous architect who created the designs for the Sagrada Familia, the cathedral in Barcelona. I list some others.
You mentioned also one that I don't know, Venerable Madeleine de Brel.
Del Brel. She's a French lady who lived. She passed away, I believe, in the late 60s or early 70s. She lived during the war in France. Was an atheist, and then came to the faith through actually Dominican. And she lived in a town or city, small city, that was communist. France was really divided between, and so she was amongst these atheistic communists and had a great influence. There are a number of the spiritual director when the great Pope John Paul II was a young man and teenager and young man, a Polish single layman who he had a Carmelite kind of spirituality, and he formed a prayer group that John Paul II was part of. and he
Right.
credits him of being very
Yep.
instrumental to his faith.
Yeah.
There are so many examples, and of course,
Yeah.
the more I include people that had profound impact on society or on others, but from a deeply, they were living out their faith
Yeah.
in this.
I mean, I guess we can
respect.
count Pierre Giorgio in that camp also, right? Yep. I know he died young, but still living his single lay vocation to the max.
And then you have, I wouldn't, they're not equivalent, but you have, for example, Siena, Catherine of Siena. Now she was a third order Dominican,
She was,
so it was
yeah, she
different.
was,
But
yeah.
she lived at home, and could have she done what she did, literally going to Avignon and telling the Pope to buck up,
Exactly.
and get himself back to Rome.
Exactly.
Could she have done all she did? The influence she had in her town, being back then, to be a religious was to be behind walls, to behind grills. And so there really are examples in the Catholic Church history of people there. I mention in here, there's a figure, I can never pronounce his name, in the Old Testament, who was a very gifted, skilled craftsman who was tasked by God to create the Ark of the Covenant. And he was single, and it talked like his whole life was about creating these beautiful objects.
Yeah.
That God used. So you don't, you just.
You also mentioned Simon of Cyrene as kind of a patron saint, so to speak, of dedicated singles. Why?
That's if I could ever make those.
Yeah. If you can make those
decisions.
distinctions.
So Simon of Cyrene, think about
Ask
it.
Ask your Dominican friend back in Rome. You just send him a text.
You'd think, and it's captured so beautifully in the Passion of the Christ, the film by. Anyway, he was basically told and pulled by the Roman soldiers to help Christ carry his cross when it was getting so heavy for Christ. He literally he went kicking and screaming. Then he helps Jesus one side, help carrying the cross. And during those moments of him carrying the cross with Jesus, he came, I'm going to tear up because I think it's so beautiful. He came to love Jesus. And you think that's like this vocation. Like you go kicking and screaming to be able to be in this intimate relationship and position with Christ, which is really cherished. You think you mentioned Christ the King. I mean, he is a king, Christ the King, and he's choosing you. He's like, no, you're not made for a human spouse. I want you for myself. And you go kicking and screaming because you're just like, it's this one. And it's not until you walk with him and journey with him for a while, just you and him, that you come to appreciate, oh my gosh, I hit the home run. This is just extraordinary. And I have this intimate, incredible opportunity to have this relationship with Jesus like others might not, just you and him. And I think that Simon of Cyrene, it's so visual. It's like he was literally kicking and screaming. And then at the end, remember in the film, he captured this so well, Mel Gibson. The people were kind of making fun of Jesus and throwing things at him. And he just stood up and says, hey, don't do that. Like he defended him. When in the beginning, he rejected this opportunity to be next to him.
Wow. That's incredible.
That is the single vocation, I think. Dedicated single vocation, kind of in a visual crystallization.
Yeah. Well, maybe not everybody needs to go in kicking and screaming. Maybe.
Yeah.
But the point's well taken. You kind of think it's one trajectory, and we have to let go of whatever our ideals are. And in that process, again, I reiterate to everybody listening, is a personal process of discernment, and one that requires a lot of prayer and conversation with a trusted spiritual director. And that if it is this invitation to let go and to unite yourself with Christ on the cross, as you so beautifully shared with us, then there's a profound invitation to be close to him and to be one with him, and then to experience and see him and to be transformed because of that. It's just beautiful. Well, Luanne, I've deeply appreciated our conversation. Better than the first one. I want to let everybody know. Better than the first one. This was fantastic.
Well,
And
I really appreciate the opportunity to, I wrote this a few years ago and we were talking early. It's been a while, and it actually helps me because I even kind of you get lazy and you take things for granted. And it's helpful to kind of remind yourself of why God's chosen you to do what He's chosen you to do. So thank you for that opportunity.
Yeah, you're welcome. You're welcome. It's always a gift. I find when I go back and read something that I wrote a few years ago, I have a really bad memory. I remember having a good memory, but that's gone. And I go back and I read something. I'm like, wow, this wasn't bad. Who wrote this? I'm like, oh, that guy knew what he was talking about. It wasn't too bad. So final question I ask all my guests, what gives you hope?
God. Our hope is in God, and He will not disappoint.
What does that mean for you?
It means that He's got everything covered. I mean, gosh, things are so crazy in our world, and in the end, we're made for union with Him. Yeah. This is what is Teresa of Avila says, this is just like a night in the bad hotel. Yeah. I mean, we are made for union with Him, and the more I grow in my faith, the more I appreciate the Catholic Church. I mean, we have been given so much. The Catholic Church is given it. Yes, there's problems, it's flawed, but you know what? It is our way to Christ. It is truly God. I think Jesus is one of His great. The Eucharist it's only in the context of the Catholic Church. It's such a gift. And so I think, what gives me hope is we're given the church to help guide our way through these treacherous waters to an eternity of pure joy and bliss with God. That's what we're made for. And so, it makes all the problems pale in comparison. I think of all these poor young people and not so young people being killed in wars or in other tragic circumstances. And I think you just pray for their soul because I think, let's hope through the mercy of God they find their way to be with Him in all eternity. And
Amen.
That's what we're living. It is all about getting to heaven.
Amen. Amen. Well said. Thanks, Luanne. It's so beautiful. Thank you for just sharing all of that and offering that little exhortation for us, exhortation for us right at the end there.
Well, thank you.
All right, everybody. Well, that does it for today's episode, and I hope it provided some great content and fodder for prayer for those of you who are, in fact, discerning a dedicated single life. Be not afraid to embrace whatever path God has given to us. If you in your heart still feel that marriage is where you're called to, then continue to pursue that until God tells you otherwise. If you feel that in your prayer and discernment that God is opening you up to other options, then consider those options as well and be courageous to where the Lord may in fact be calling you. Life, as they say, is a journey, and it's not always straight. And as we said, that beautiful quote from Benedict, which gives us God gives us the capacity to be able to make straight with crooked lines. That's who the Lord is. That's what He does. And so we have to continue to trust and surrender to Him as we continue to walk on this journey towards holiness, towards the path that He has for us. So many blessings to you wherever you may be. God bless you guys. Thanks for chiming in, and hope you're all doing well. Bye.